Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Karen Mock. I won't waste time by introducing myself more fully. Just Google, as long as you don't pay attention to what people say about me from radical right and radical left sources. And on that note, welcome to, on behalf of the Enhancing Social Justice Education group, which I am honored to chair. And I really want to thank the Harmony Movement for hosting us and the Equity Summit Group and Ontario Principals Council for being our promotional sponsors of today's webinar, in the same way as all those groups supported us with the conference that we held last December on Stop the Hate, Start the Dialogue. And this webinar is the last in a series that followed that conference, moving more deeply into the topics that you told us you wanted to hear more of. So welcome from across the country. You'll see later the number of people that have joined us. And before we go into it, I do want to give the land acknowledgement and acknowledge that we are all zooming in from the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, among others, now home to many diverse nations, Inuit and Métis people. I myself am calling in from Algonquin, Anishinaabeg, traditional territory. The Algonquin were one of the first Indigenous nations that Champlain recorded as he traveled up the Kitchissippi, now called the Ottawa River. It was an elder who taught me, and from whom I learned, that the feeling often is that these land acknowledgements are given in a very pro forma way. And so what we like to do in the Enhancing Social Justice Education group is tie it in to what we are doing, what our values are, and how we can learn, certainly, from the elders and from Indigenous people. So the land acknowledgement is a small but important step in the process of reconciliation and building positive relationships with Indigenous peoples. It is a recognition of their presence, both in the past and the present. Recognition and respect, and I emphasize this as you can see it's underlined, are essential elements of establishing healthy, reciprocal relationships that are key to reconciliation. We must also remember that we are all accountable to these relationships. It involves thinking about what happened in the past, the impact of trauma, including inherited community trauma, on mental health and well-being. But we must also consider what changes can be made going forward. And that's what we're going to talk about today, going forward. In order to further the reconciliation process and to strengthen relationships with all those impacted by colonization, discrimination, and oppression, and in keeping with our values of human rights, equity, inclusion, and social justice. And we do make the assumption that everyone joining us today, involved in your workplaces and educational institutions, in government agencies, and community organizations across the country, that they're in keeping with your values too. And by the way, those weren't just my notes I was reading from. Some of our slides that I and the speaker will show you have lots of words in them. It's not that we're reading from our notes, it's that we're going to provide you with a recording of this webinar so that you have all the slides and also the banter that goes with them. It was Her Excellency Mary Simon who reminded us that reconciliation is a way of life and requires work every day. Reconciliation is getting to know one another. And how do we do that? Communication is the key. But why have I underlined real communication? When we do communications workshops, we learn that communication, real communication, is the exchange of shared meaning. These days, we're arguing an awful lot about words. But if I use a word and you have a different meaning for that word than I intended, then we're not communicating. And these days, people are doing far too much arguing over words. And what we'd like to do is stop arguing over words and get down to the business of enhancing social justice, real justice, equity, and inclusion for all. And the key in our work, we always used to say in anti-racism work that our work was about putting ourselves in the other's shoes. This is one of my favorite cartoons because we can work it out if we really do start to see things from the other's perspective. Empathy is the key. So just because you are right does not mean that I'm wrong. You just haven't seen life from my side. And these days we talk about accepting and understanding each other's narratives. Well, two people can experience the very same thing, but their narratives, their perception of the same event might be very different. I mean, in that cartoon, if one person saw on his side of the floor 5, 6, 7, 8, then it's a 6. And if the other guy saw 7, 8, 9, 10, they have different narratives, different learnings from their community. And so they do see things differently. And it's our job in our work, in anti-oppression and human rights work, social justice work, to see things from the other's perspective in order to find the common ground. But I do need to tell you a little bit about who we are for those who are learning about the Enhancing Social Justice Education Group for the first time. We were founded in 2011 and launched publicly in 2013. Some people at OISE, the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, reached out to me and I reached out to others because we discovered that in the Social Justice and Equity Studies Department, anti-Semitism and Holocaust education had been removed from their curriculum, when in the past, when we introduced multiculturalism, anti-racism, equity, and inclusion, it was very much an inclusive curriculum about all of the isms and phobias. And so our original mission, we provide educational programs and resources for teachers, students, and community in order to reinstate anti-Semitism and Holocaust studies into social justice education. And we are a truly inclusive group, not just Jewish people, but people from all backgrounds and various stages and institutions in the education system at every level, and education broadly defined. We adhere to inclusive, anti-racist, and equity education principles, and we pay careful attention to systemic oppression, intersectionality, and the relationship between and among all oppressions. Our vision, in other words, what we will have achieved when our mission is complete, and we hope and pray that it one day will be complete, and we will experience truly inclusive social justice education such that no learner or educator is silenced or marginalized. No learner is silenced or marginalized. But in our initial promotional material for this session that perhaps got you to sign up and join us, we specified that while diversity, equity, and inclusion are important initiatives, agencies must understand that employees can be included, and we even put it in quotation marks because it may be the illusion of inclusion, or it may be tokenism with one of them on a larger committee, whoever the them is, that employees can be included, but also oppressed at the same time. Therefore, it's imperative, as we said in our promotional material, that we understand the forces and mechanisms that oppress complex identities. Sometimes people pay lip service to this notion of, well, we shouldn't be having the anti-oppression Olympics and we shouldn't be competing with each other. And I say it's lip service because today we have even heard in diversity spaces and on diversity committees that some voices are heard and others aren't. Or there's comparison of who is more discriminated against. We certainly need the identity groups and the support groups, but we need allies among all those groups to be part of the struggle in supporting one another. I'm also noting that there are some people who are fully conversant and understand fully the impact of oppression on mental health, the impact on the individual. But there's a movement afoot to say, well, if somebody didn't mean it, then it isn't really oppression, or it isn't really racism, or Islamophobia, or anti-Semitism, or homophobia. But it's okay to use the language and not argue about it. Yes, it's not a hate crime unless there is actual hate motivation. But in our work, we definitely have to pay attention to the impact of speech, to the impact of actions, to the impact of systemic discrimination, marginalization, and silencing of anyone on the basis of their identity. So here's how we're going to handle this situation and this seminar today, or webinar, or Zoom meeting. First, I'll introduce our wonderful keynote speaker, and he'll make a presentation, a brief keynote address. We'll have a response panel of outstanding professionals in the field of diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism, anti-oppression, and the list goes on. And they'll discuss amongst themselves as well, representing what is the meaning of how we take equity to the next level for administrators, for employers, for educators all. And then we'll have some questions and answers. Some people sent theirs in ahead of time. We'll have opportunity to discuss amongst ourselves after resources and a wrap up of the formal part and the recorded part. And then we'll have the parking lot discussion. Some people don't want to have their discussion recorded. And so you know what it's like when you can grab the speaker and get some clarification. Some people call it the water cooler conversation. And why do I have a clock there? Because our one thing that we can promise you is that we're going to run out of time. I also have the clock there to remind me to stop talking and to get on with the program. Because those of you who know me, once I get wound up, that's it. And I'm very excited about the session that we're having today. So allow me, without further ado, to introduce our terrific speakers. Chris D'Souza has been an equity and human rights strategist for over 20 years. He was recently hired to teach at the Faculty of Education at Wilfrid Laurier University. I've known Chris for almost 25 years through our work with the Ontario Anti-Racist Multicultural Educators Association and its spin-off group, because that was the association was for educators broadly defined in every walk of life. And the spin-off group, the Equity Summit Group, is a network of educators that Chris chairs, educators that are in school boards and in universities doing anti-racist, equity, anti-oppression education. His most recent book, I say the recent book because if you haven't read Kicking the Elephant's Ankle, you should, about colonization in a way that young people can understand and know that we need equity and inclusion for all. But his most recent book is called A Crash Course on Anti-Oppression, Examining Classism, Racism, Ableism, Sexism, and Heterosexism, hence a crash course. But Chris's approach, as is ours, is inclusive. Those are the top 5, and he'll highlight those. The book is personal, and he calls it a collection of thought catalysts. I love the subtitle, though, because it says, includes unpacking the BS in bias. So you're in for a treat with his opening remarks. Kulbir Dhaliwal is a school-based principal in Simcoe County and also the chair of the Ontario Principals Council EDI Advisory Committee. He has been engaged in anti-oppressive work for many years, both his current role and also in his previous time with the Peel District School Board. Kulbir also is the EDI director on the OPC Board of Directors. So thank you for representing the Ontario Principals Council here today. And people know that they can certainly turn to the Principals Council for assistance in this work. Leslie Wolfe is a former high school teacher with the TDSB and the immediate past president of the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation, Toronto District 12. She served as chief negotiator for the TDSB's secondary teachers from 2000 to 2011. Wow. And as an executive officer on the OSSTF provincial executive from 2011 to 2013. Leslie is a very active member and currently serves on the coordinating committee of this group, the Enhancing Social Justice Education Group, and I'm thrilled to be working with her. And she's also on the board of Toronto's first intentionally two-spirited LGBTQ plus Jewish congregation. Throughout her career, Leslie has continued to focus on the importance of community and of the importance to communities of equity and inclusion of all voices. And last but not least, because in fact he'll end up going first on the panel, is Hamlin Grange. He's an internationally recognized expert in equity, diversity, inclusion, anti-racism, and intercultural competence. As the founding president of DiversiPro, he has worked extensively with regulatory bodies, educational institutions, and public sector organizations to build inclusive cultures and develop strategic EDI framework. I've known Hamlin, I guess it's going on 30 years now, Hamlin. And he is widely respected for his leadership in creating spaces where difficult conversations can lead to meaningful, sustainable change. And these days, we all need to learn how to handle difficult conversations. Without further ado, I turn the microphone and the screen sharing over to Chris D'Souza. Take it away, Chris.
Apologize for the lighting. It's been a while since I've done a virtual presentation. This is the best. I went and got a light in the middle of the introductions, so you can see my beautiful brown face. Whenever I refer to identity, I always say beautiful black, wonderfully white, beautiful brown. Those of you who have seen me, I'm going to start my timer. I'm going to do exactly 20 minutes as as requested. Let's bust into it. First of all, I want to thank Karen for putting this together, for continuing to be a friend, ally. She is one of the giants upon whose shoulders many of us have stood upon. I'm blessed by her friendship and allyship. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. My favorite introduction is father, educator, and SHIT disturber, because we're gonna disturb some shit. Let's bust into it. So today's program will use the theoretical framework. Any program I use, whether it's 90 minutes, 20 minutes, 5 hours, 3 days, I have a 3 day program. I use this theoretical framework, comes from bell hooks. And it says Canadians navigate the oppressive mechanisms and forces of heterosexism, patriarchy, heteropatriarchy, and white supremacy. Feel free to take a picture of any of the slides if you want to use with your organization. If you're not a school board, I know we have primarily school boards registered, but if you want to use it in your classroom, absolutely. So some key principles of this program. Colonization is the root of all oppression. And in my book, I attempt to draw a straight line from white Christian colonization to the five big oppressions that I talk about in the book, as Karen has said: classism, racism, ableism, sexism, and heterosexism. Patriarchy is one of the mechanisms that reinforces these oppressions. So just two quick stories for you to build a relationship with me. I am one of you. I am an educator. I retired at 50, 10 years ago because of some of the oppression I was experiencing in a Catholic school board. They refused to promote me to vice principal, even though I had all the credentials, because they told me I needed to tone down my gay rights rhetoric. I refused, and I left the profession. And it's not a woe is me narrative. I began a consultancy. I had taught at York University. I had a wonderful time at York University. And these are our three children there: Jamie, Dakota, Cadence, in front of our pride flag. The first one we put up about 9 years ago was much smaller. But I remember after I put it up, one of my neighbors comes over and he says to me, "Well, why do you have to fly that flag? You're not even gay." And I looked at him and said, "Well, you don't frickin' play for the Toronto Maple Leafs." So my point is, we 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 don't call this work. This is who we are. We are always having to challenge back when we are promoting love and dignity for groups that are marginalized. Another quick story. I taught at Brock University in the Faculty of Education just before COVID for 3 years. And I was given a sociology class with 600 people, still in the Faculty of Ed. I was teaching the sociology of oppression, how we are taught to either interrupt or reinforce oppressive mechanisms. So I said to the class on day one, this was the Tuesday after Labor Day, they were beginning their 6-year journey to becoming teachers. I said, "Welcome to the most wonderful profession on planet Earth." I said, but looking at the audience at Brock, it was predominantly white. I said, if you are not fully prepared to embrace the notion that school systems can oppress, and as a teacher, when I think about you teaching for the next 3 decades after you graduate, if you are not fully prepared to interrupt sexism, heterosexism, ableism, classism, identify the oppressions and interrupt them, if you're not fully engaged in that, you should not be a teacher. This is what I said to them. I said, plenty of time to leave class right now and go join another faculty. I said, and I meant that. Teachers are very powerful individuals, and they can interrupt oppression or they can replicate it. I don't teach at Brock anymore. And so we are going to talk about the fact that I'm not even going to say, there was a lot of nonsense at Brock, and I was brought there because of some racist complaints, and they realized that Their complement of instructors and professors was not diverse. And so the point, even in the abstract that went out, is that we need to move beyond DEI. You can include somebody, but then oppress them, silence their voice. And so the principle of this program is that when we have these diverse bodies at the table, they must be given agency, they must be given a voice, and they must be listened to. Okay, I'm just trying to, there we go. So diversity, equity, and inclusion are important, but as the abstract, as I just said, organizations, school boards can include from marginalized groups, but still oppress. I spent a lot of time being a sounding board and a mentor to people doing equity work. Four of the individuals that I've been listening to and supporting over the last 2 years are four Black women in four different school boards, all in equity positions. All four of them have left the profession. This is how toxic doing equity work can be. So once again, if you are bringing somebody with a marginalized identity to the table, you've got to listen to them. Okay, there we go. I'm just going to move through the slides quickly. You can read them on your own. Is somebody admitting people into the room? Yeah, awesome. There continues to be people joining. Marginalized individuals must be given voice. Sorry, I've got two PowerPoints going because some of the thumbnails of people are covering my screen. So when they do, the hegemony must listen and act accordingly. So while school boards strive to be equitable, the places children and educators journey from, for example, home and other countries, they might be very inequitable. The Canadian landscape is very stratified economically, and there is a corollary between racialization and low income. And that comes from the wonderful Dr. Grace Edward Galabuzzi, who wrote a seminal work called Canada's Economic Apartheid. So while we strive in school boards to make classrooms equitable, the places where they come from, they might not have access to resources like other families do. So therefore, it is critical that all of us seek out mechanisms, protocols, policies that oppress employees and students and clients. A quick definition. I'm not going to provide definitions for the five oppressions. You can look them up or go to AI, just given the time permitting. But I do want to obviously talk about oppression. So oppression in its simplest definition is it describes a set of policies, practices, traditions, norms, definitions, and explanations which function to systemically exploit one social group to the benefit of another social group. And that key piece is that one social group benefits at the expense of another. The example, you remember, those rich actors were getting their children into universities through a backdoor payment, and they says, well, there's no harm done, right? This is a victimless reality. Not true. The people who lost their spots because of this, wealthy families buying into the universities, they got in at the expense of somebody who did not have the economic wherewithal to do the same. And so the oppressions that I'm asking those who are in, whether you're an educator or a principal or EA, a board consultant, or if you're not even in educational spaces, the oppressions that we want you to try and determine are classism, racism, ableism, sexism, and heterosexism. So I came up with this concept, this strategy, just a couple of days ago, actually, in order for this webinar. We need to recognize, analyze, sometimes called praxis. So praxis, there's two moments in practice. It's when you recognize the inequity, and stage two is then, what can you do to minimize or mitigate the oppression that is being exerted on that child, on that teacher, on that parent group, right? Recognize, analyze, mobilize. So who do you mobilize with? You know who is on your staff that has an equity lens. or they're leaning in. They want to learn. You need to consult with them. If it's a child who needs support by C.A.S., by a social worker, by a child and youth worker, you need to consult with them. There is a process by which you mobilize. Now, one of the key pieces of any presentation like this is that we have to recognize that there are some realities that we cannot change, and hence we are complicit in the oppression. A primary example is EQAO. We can, it came in with the Harris government. No government is going to remove that. The parent guardian communities like standardized testing, but those of us in the equity field know that EQAO is not only classist, there's a multiple forms of oppression that are exerted on students because of standardized testing. Those who have access to, I give the example during COVID, everybody, there's the comment was, oh, everybody's in the same boat. Not true. My family, I was able to buy each of my children an iPad to do their schooling, where there were some families that had 4 children and shared one iPad. Yes, it was given to you by the school, but that's a very, very different class reality in regards to successful outcomes, right? So I'm also going to say to my audience, and this is part of the discussion that we had yesterday as a precursor to this webinar, I know you want specific tools and answers. Humans and educators, we love a drop-down menu. We discover this, we want to be able to have a list of solutions provided to us. But in the landscape of identity politics and anti-oppression work, every human interaction, every situation is a unique reality that needs to be examined with a hyper-critical lens. So this is about critical thinking. This is about you engaging and mobilizing with somebody who you can put your heads together and say, you know what, we might not be able to eradicate what's taking place, eradicate the oppression, but if we can mitigate it, if we can minimize it to the best of our ability, we're at least hopefully moving that child or that employee towards a better journey of success. So the example I threw out even yesterday was hot lunches in school. I remember when my son was in grade 8, I said to him, he had pizza. He wanted 2 slices of pizza. He was getting bigger. I said, yeah, absolutely. And then I said, by the way, how many students in your class? He said, Daddy, about 28. I said, how many of them get pizza? And he says, I think about 24. And I said, well, what about those other 4 that don't get pizza? And it might be for they don't like pizza. It might be a dietary reason, which can be solved too, right? But the reality is how do they feel on a Friday when 24 of their colleagues or their classmates are getting pizza and they're left out, maybe because of financial reasons? So we go, and I know hot lunches generate income for the school. I'm not saying not to do that, but Kulbir chimed in and he said, yes, Chris, that's a good example. I pay attention. We have a slush fund and resources that we access to make sure that everybody partakes. And so a good administrator is going to pay attention to the things we do and watch for those realities where a child is being potentially marginalized. Okay, I want to end with a concept called white think, and it's going to take about 5 or 6 minutes for me to go into it. I'm very excited about it. It's not in the book, actually. It's something that I've been working through with the group. I run a program called Mentoring Racialized and Indigenous Teachers for Leadership, and this is a concept that I've newly put in the table. But before I get to that, very important, it's been suggested to me that as keynote that I bring out some key points as part of this journey. Identities do not exist in a vacuum, right? They intersect like a tapestry. So I am not just a beautiful brown man. I mean beautiful brown. I'm talking about the color, whether you think I'm beautiful or not. I'm talking about the color of my skin being beautiful, right? I use that language. That identity intersects with very, very privileged identities. I am a very privileged individual. I am cisgendered, male, I'm Christian, which carries privilege in a colonized Christian landscape, right? I am economically very stable. I've worked hard to be where I am. And so I recognize my privileges and how they intersect, but I also pay attention to the places where I can be marginalized or oppressed. That leads into bullet number 2. Some identities can be oppressed in one space, but hold power and privilege in another. Two oppressions can be true at the same time. And this is the very common, where the speaker is going to address this later. We can't negate the reality that one group is oppressed. This is not the oppression Olympics. And here's what happened. When marginalized groups compete or are in conflict with each other, the hegemony wins. We need to stay unified if we're going to slowly dismantle the oppressions that exist within workspaces, within school boards, within classrooms. Here's just you've probably seen this from Kimberly Crenshaw. Intersectionality is the lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it locks and intersects. It is the acknowledgement that everyone has their own unique experiences of discrimination and privilege. So white think, here we go. Before I explain white think, I very strategically and caringly explain to my audiences, which are often dominated by white individuals, that the teaching profession is still white heavy. The loose data is that 80% of the teachers, the OCT in the province, are still white. When you look at administration, less than 1% of the vice principals, principals, superintendents, directors in the province, less than 1% are racialized or Indigenous. It is actually unethical. So I explain to my audiences that I understand that white people can experience oppression. Whiteness is not a superhero cape that protects them from things like addiction, depression, job loss, divorce, which cause mental unwellness, mental instability. White people, however, cannot experience racism. There is no such thing as reverse racism, and I don't have time to explain. You can type that into a chat GPT and learn for yourself. Another key piece around white supremacy, just explaining white privilege and white supremacy before I get to white think. White supremacy is the reality that in Canada, whiteness is still the major power dynamic, socially, economically, and politically. And I'm asking you not to get defensive about this. Just trust me. And this is part of the work too. When you have racialized identities in your spaces, believe that their experience and their narrative is real. Never ask them to defend their experience of racism. Just like you should never ask a woman to defend her experience of sexism, the same thing should apply to an Indigenous individual or a racialized individual or a Jewish individual or a Muslim individual. Believe that if they've experienced trauma and toxicity, your goal is to listen and then say, what can I do to help you? That's what allyship means. Right? Tyrone Dowling, who just a wonderful black man, beautiful black man, who just retired from Wellington Catholic, he says, our allies need to leave skin in the game. Right? A beautiful comment, leaving skin in the game when we are dealing with marginalized groups. So very quickly, in 4 minutes. So epistemology is the theory of knowledge. It is concerned with the mind's relation to reality. Today, I'm going to argue that white think has a massive impact on your mind's relation to reality, and it plays a major role in the landscape of oppression. To set a context, identity has already been linked with epistemology. For example, feminist epistemology has often been understood as the study of feminine ways of knowing, but feminist epistemology is better understood as the study of various influences of norms and conceptions of gender and gendered interests. So, white think epistemology is the study of white ways of knowing. Ergo, white think epistemology is better understood as the social epistemology that studies the various influences of norms and conceptions of whiteness, white supremacy, white privilege, and racialization. So here's a slide that you want to take a picture of. And if you want it, I'll send it to you, send me an email. So white privilege at the top increases one's access to resources. At the bottom left, white supremacy is the social hierarchy, and white think is the ideology. Now, let me get to the key piece for me and for my audiences. So, white supremacy, racialized and Indigenous bodies, in regards to white supremacy, are oppressed by it. White privilege usually marginalizes those groups because we have no access to it. I make a joke that when I go to the hockey arena, my son plays hockey. My partner and my son are actually on the way to Sudbury right now for a hockey tournament. When I join a new team, I tell people I bring my white privilege along with me. I bring Maria, my partner's white. It's a kind of little joke I have, but really I do, right? This discomfort. I'm often the only racialized dad in many spaces in the hockey landscape. So then white think we are socialized by it and we can be inculcated by it. So here's the key piece here. Racialized people can propagate white think. And you know you've heard racialized people say, oh, well, this is not that racist or et cetera. They try to mitigate. They call it a microaggression. I don't like that term microaggression. Even within the word itself, it minimizes the experience of trauma that a racialized or indigenous person has been exposed to. White think in action. I'm just looking at my time. 1 minute. Here we go. You know what? I don't have time to give examples. I'm going to move on just to be respectful of the time that I've been given. Here's some key aspects of white think. That whiteness is neutral when it is not. That there is a resistance to the reality of white privilege and white supremacy. White think is not limited to white people. Racialized and indigenous people can subscribe to, propagate, replicate, and reinforce white think consciously and unconsciously. So just as I wrap up my keynote, I want to let you know some of the work that I do. Coming up on April 23rd is the fourth annual, I know I call it DEI, I still got to play the game. You call it anti-oppression unless people pay attention. So you got to use the Trojan reality, the Trojan moniker of DEI. This is the fourth, sorry, I apologize. This is the fifth one, the fourth annual one. We partnered with OPC. Irfan, I was done after three. The marketing was hard. Irfan Tour, a wonderful ally of mine, said, you know what, this is a great project. Let's partner. And he did the back end. So the fifth annual conference is coming up April 23rd, 2026. It's in Toronto. The theme, so my brand is mentoring racialized and Indigenous employees for leadership. We changed the theme to meet the current landscape. The current theme is challenging oppression in schools amidst the rise of right-wing ideology, and there will be workshops on the implementation of Bill 33 and its impact on equity initiatives in schools, and there will be a workshop on engaging advocacy groups. There are wonderful advocacy groups that are holding school boards accountable to when they oppress students around their racial identity. We need to be able to engage them in order to serve the students who are being marginalized. And finally, that is my website. My personal email, my personal cell phone is on my website, chrisdesouza.ca. Karen's holding up the book. Thank you, Karen. The holidays are coming. I make a joke. Nothing says happy holidays like a book on anti-oppression. And if you want to join the Equity Summit group, we have 300 members. It is recognized by the Ministry of Education of Ontario. It's a collaborative. There's no cost to join. Send me an email. I will add you to the list. I only send out one email every other week announcing good resources, announcing upcoming webinars. And so if you're in the virtual space right now, send me an email and I will add you to the list. Thank you so much for listening. I'll turn it back over to Karen and I'm going to mute myself.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chris, who gets us started. I have to do, again, I'm for those of you who joined more recently, I'm moderating this next panel, and I want to turn it over right to them. However, I don't know what happened to my screen at the bottom. There is supposed to be a Q&A function, and I'm not sure that the chat was I believe it was disabled because the Q&A function was supposed to be where you can put your questions through. Has anybody tried to put the question through the chat? Or David Grosskine, can you help us out here? If for some reason the Q&A has been disabled because people were able to pose their questions. So while we're sorting that out, I'm going to turn the microphone over to our panelists. Now, they didn't exactly draw straws to see who would go first, but
I got voluntold.
Hamlin won because he missed our little meeting yesterday. So he was volunteered to go first. Now, notice, again, for those of you who joined after all the introductions, our panelists are going to focus on different implications. Um, there were some questions that came in ahead of time. Um, those who had registered before the weekend had an opportunity to send their questions in first, and they're different. One person asked, how do we address parents who may feel uncomfortable with this topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion being taken to the next level and understanding anti-oppression? Another person asked us, or gave us a little bit of a preamble of the context that they're feeling. Some groups, and here's what she wrote, some groups are excluded from DEI and are being subjected to discrimination and harassment. And so she asked, does anti-oppression focus on the evolution of DEI, or is it a separate entity? And where DEI principles dissolve, again, I guess because of, as I mentioned earlier in our introduction, where DEI principles dissolve, will they be replaced with anti-oppression principles? And interestingly enough, DEI and the whole evolution from multiculturalism to anti-racism to equity was based on anti-racism and anti-oppression principles. So I'm not sure if we're talking about now starting to implement these anti-oppression principles that somehow in some DEI spaces has been undermined and a different hegemony has taken place. So the actual question was, is continuing to advocate for DEI important, or can or should we move beyond DEI mindset and put more of our energies into anti-oppression? And I guess we should perhaps make it even a little bit more generic: human rights, anti-racism, anti-oppression work. That was the question. Now, our three panelists are going to take what Chris said and the issues that are assaulting EDI, DEI today and focus on different areas. Hamlin, in terms of the workplace, in terms of the kind of clientele that he has and the siege that some of the DEI is under, or people even calling 20 years later and saying, help me, Hamlin, as I get calls like that, and I'm sure many of you do, because they're hearing the same things now that they heard 20 years ago. And so Hamlin will focus on that. When Leslie comes up, she'll be focusing more on the union implications and labor and some of the challenges happening now. And Kulbir will focus on the role of the administrator, the principal, and so on. So Hamlin, without further ado, I turn it over to you and to the panel.
Sure.
They will each have a few minutes just to make opening remarks and then talk amongst themselves a bit, and then we open it up to all of you.
Yeah, well, thank you, Karen. And hello everyone. It's great to see the names. I'm not seeing all the faces, but it's great to see the names on the screen. It occurred to me as Chris was making his presentation that if we were in the United States, we would not be having this conversation. I don't want us to think about that for a minute. And I seriously mean it. Think about that for a minute. What Chris has said, and just the conversation we're having now, would not be allowed in parts of the United States. And that, I think, should worry all of us. Not just if you're American, but if you're a Canadian, for whatever part of the world you live in. Because what Chris was talking about, I think, are issues that have an impact on people. And what's the most common place that people gather? Is the workplace. And I think if we're not prepared to have these conversations and to come out the other end feeling whole, feeling seen, being heard, I think we're doing a disservice to people in the workplace. We encourage folks in the workplace to bring your whole self. Well, we know that's not true. How can you bring your whole self if you're not prepared to listen to the whole person? Um, it's interesting what Chris talked about when he said that he left a profession. And there's actually a term for folks like you, Chris. And Deborah Meyerson, she's a researcher, writer. She wrote a book from Stanford University. She wrote a book many, many years ago. It's an old book. It's called Tempered Radicals. And I encourage the audience members to find this book, especially as educators or leaders, because Chris is an example of a tempered radical. A tempered radical is that individual who cannot remain silent, is that individual that sees the workplace and thinks about ways of changing it for the betterment of the workplace. And it can be small change or it could be a big change. But this is the individual that cannot remain silent. They're tempered radicals. They're fiercely loyal to an organization, but they will rock the boat. They'll never tip it over. It gets a lot of people wet. And people are uncomfortable with the tempered radicals. The temptation for leaders within organizations is to shut down the tempered radical. Deborah Meyerson says you need to activate the tempered radical. It's a tempered radical within your organization that can help the organization to move forward in any change process. Leaders, managers, they don't like tempered radicals because it drives them crazy. They're constantly saying, I got an idea. How about this? How about that? And said, oh, will you stop it? You need to activate tempered radicals. And so I tell organizational leaders often that you need to identify the tempered radical within your organization and activate those individuals. The tempered radical is oftentimes not the person is your head of HR. It's not your VP. It's oftentimes not even the CEO. It could be as someone as, I'll use the word loosely, lowly, as somebody working in the mailroom. But this person has drawn deep respect from their colleagues within the organization. They are fiercely loyal to the organization. They know how the organization operates. This is oftentimes where you find your tempered radicals. And organizational leaders need to find out and seek out these tempered radicals. So it occurred to me, Chris, as you were talking, you're a tempered radical, my man. Embrace it. Embrace, and I'm sure there are many tempered radicals in this group right now. Embrace that. It's a good thing to be a tempered radical because you are fiercely committed to your organization, but you're always looking for ways to change. Another thing that occurred to me as you were talking, Chris, um, there's a book that Simon Sinek wrote. It's called The Infinite Mind. And I think it's such a powerful way of looking at changing organizational structures, especially when you start talking about diversity, equity, inclusion. And I'm going to say it, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I ask folks, if you're against DEI, which one of the alphabets, which one of the letters are you against? Are you against diversity? Because diversity at the end of the day is just about difference. That's all it is. It's variety. Are you against variety? Okay. No, I'm okay with variety, they say. Okay. The E, okay? It's equity. It's giving everybody an opportunity to get into the door. You know the whole analogy about being invited to the dance, but not being invited to actually dance. All right. Equity is about giving everybody an opportunity to come and do your thing on the dance floor. Are you against that? Oh no, I'm not against that. Okay, so you're good with equity. How about inclusion? Okay. Inclusion is really about valuing those differences. It's about listening, it's about hearing folks and all of their concerns. Are you against that? No, I'm not. So tell me, which one of DEI are you against? I think we can go down this rabbit hole of the DEI construct, and DEI has become this new four-letter word. And organizational leaders and politicians are riding the bandwagon. You have a politician in Ottawa, Giovanni. bring together a group of folks in Ottawa to talk about liberal racism. It is this dog whistle thing it's dividing folks. And we're seeing it happening within organizations. And so what I tell organizational leaders is that they need to first of all acknowledge that there is a problem, be prepared to have those difficult conversations, all right? And give folks an opportunity to listen and to share. Now, I'm not saying that there shouldn't be boundaries put around that because I think you have to be very careful about that, especially after October 7th. I had a lot of phone calls on the Hamas and Israeli conflict. All right. And so at what point do you shut it down? What point do you open it up? Every organization is different. And I think it's always a danger to give folks a one size fit all. I think it's very dangerous. I think there's something else that really got me thinking when Chris was talking about school boards may be equitable, um, but they can also oppress folks. Um, there's a terminology in intercultural competence development called minimization. Minimization is the temptation to just look at what we have in common and the failure to acknowledge the differences. And a great example of minimization is the hot lunches. We assume everybody wants a hot lunch. Okay? The acceptance mindset, and from the intercultural competence development perspective, is to be curious about those differences. And within organizations, it's really important to listen to the differences and the commonalities for you to be a much more effective organization. And so for me, when you start talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, where there's anti-racism, anti-oppression, anti-sexism, all of those things, you need to be in that land of curiosity. And so it's my job, it's my desire, my role is to get organizational leaders to be more curious about differences. And yes, you are going to mess up from time to time. And the acceptance mindset of curiosity is not necessarily agreement. And I think a lot of people mistake that notion that, oh, yeah, I have to agree with you. No, I don't have to agree with you, but I can do everything in my power to understand why you may have that perspective. And I think that's what's missing right now in workplaces. Folks are not prepared to listen and to understand the other side because we're in that age of polarization right now, us versus them. And folks are going to their separate corners and they're not so neutral, let me tell you. All right. And organizational leaders, especially in the classroom, for example, you're seeing polarization within your classrooms among students. What are you doing as an educator to bridge that gap? How are you creating an environment of curiosity for them? So I'm going to end there and I just sort of said that, look, that's what triggered for me, Chris, as you were talking. And, uh, you know, God bless the temperate radical. So let's talk.
I think we should have a next webinar on tempered radicals. I just sent Chris a note to say that I myself left 3 jobs.
There you go. You're a tempered radical. You are.
Well, and
You've
I
always
think
been a
most,
tempered radical.
most of the people on the screen here who know me are thinking about some of those times and some of those challenges that we had where, we need to give voice and we need to move on. But at the same time, and never mind, not but, and at the same time, ensure that we engage people who have the ideas and who, because we need to help people who are the radicals to become strategic inside their own organizations. You know that notion, you can't be a prophet in your own land, as they say. Okay, well, I'm going to turn this over now to Leslie. And we're actually doing okay for the time. I'm a little concerned because I don't know that I've seen any questions come in besides those two, or if there's a vehicle for it. So I think instead what we might have to do while the recording is still on, allow for some of the questions that people want to be shared with everybody when we then unmute. Um, and then later we'll turn it off for the parking lot conversation, as I said earlier. Just a reminder for those who logged on late, Chris, you kept saying they can take screenshots and so on. Anybody who was registered will receive the recording that includes the slides. And often slides don't mean anything without the banter that goes with it. So I hope that people will understand that they will be able to have the recording. So Leslie, please take it away.
Thanks, Karen, and I'm really honored to be here. I said to Karen when she asked me to be on this panel, I'm not sure why. I have done a lot of work over my lifetime in, I guess, in human rights and equitable access to power structures inside the union, and perhaps that's part of why she feels that I'm um, a person that has some things to share. I also happen to be working right now within the union movement to try and create true equity by by helping people learn how to raise their voices, people who have not accessed the union before and unions before, and who have not felt that their voices have been heard. I think what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about what we call this, which is moving beyond DEI. And I found the title very interesting because of the political times in which we are living, where we see, as Hamlin mentioned, where we see the politics in the US, where we see corporations looking to distance themselves from those concepts that were once so basic, that they were so excited to sort of include in their policies. And we see people questioning one of the questions that came in about, how do we address people who are uncomfortable with the concept of DEI, and what do we do about people who feel excluded from DEI? And I think that I want to talk about, and I also want to address a little bit what Chris talked about being an activist in your place of work, or particularly in the school system, from the self-protection point of view, because there is a line which you may cross. And as a former union rep, whose job it was to provide people with protective advice, I want to also be sure that in um, in taking action, we're recognizing where the boundaries are for ourselves as employees in an employee-employer relationship, which is not a democracy, that relationship. So I think I'd like to start with, moving beyond DEI and the current political times. And for me, moving beyond DEI, like a lot of many of us who have been working uh, um, towards greater diversity, greater understanding of what equity means, and then how to implement it in our places of work. And I think I've often thought of the result being inclusion. When you have diversity and you have equity and they are both properly implemented, what you should get as a result is inclusion of everybody. But that hasn't been everybody's experience. And I know that um, there are misapprehensions about what people might call the DEI movement, and there are misunderstandings about the DEI movement and how it has been used amongst certain communities. And I think what's really important, maybe for our purposes as we move beyond DEI, and as is to think about inclusion, because inclusion includes it must, if we're being inclusive, we are being diverse, we are being equitable, we are using human rights principles, and so on. And so when I think about parents, for example, in the school system who are uncomfortable with the use of the words DEI, I loved Hamlin's question, well, which of the letters of the alphabet are you not comfortable with? But as a person in the school system, I'm not sure that it would go over well with the employer to ask a parent that question that way. I suspect that could lead to some issues, but there's there's nothing wrong with saying to somebody, Well, let me just put it to you this way. DEI really is about the I. It's about inclusion. It's about creating systems that ensure that everybody is equally included. And I don't think you'll find that there's a parent out there who will disagree with that. They may say it's not working for my child, and then there is an opportunity to address their child's specific needs and to listen and to work with that parent to ensure that whatever system is operating in your classroom or in your school that is making that parent feel that that child currently isn't fully included, that you look at that system and see how it can be modified. In terms of actually working to challenge oppressive systems um, and to create the modifications that are required, there are ways to do it um, that are offensive, and there are ways to do it that are inclusive. And I often see people standing up in ways that wind up being they're assertive and are read as offensive and wind up resulting in a feeling of exclusion. And so I've often said to people when they ask the question about, you know, how do you bring people along? You know, it's like walking, you know, it's going up a hill, right? We're all climbing this great big hill towards what we hope will be full inclusion. And you have a choice. You find somebody who's walking up that hill and they want to get to the top of the hill, but they're kind of dragging their heels. And you can grab them by the shirt collar and you can say, come with me, and you can pull them up that hill. And you can pull them and talk to them as you're pulling them. But it's what's going to likely wind up happening is you're both going to get hurt. You know, you're pulling, they're being dragged, and neither one of you is moving up that hill in a way that's healthy. The other way to help a person walk up a hill, and maybe you've done this, you know, when you're walking up a steep incline, if you go beside somebody and you put your hand, you meet them where they're at, and you put your hand on the small of their back, and you just apply gentle pressure as they're walking with you, that it becomes easier for them to climb that hill. If you've never tried it physically, you should. It does work. And it also works metaphorically in my experience. As a longtime union activist, there were times when I had to convince a room of 750 people of what I was saying and the veracity of what I was saying. And recognizing that not everybody was already where I was at, I had to start my conversations, my arguments, you know, meeting them where they were and moving them along. For those of us who are impatient and understandably impatient, already be at the point of inclusion, and why the heck aren't these systems of oppression already dismantled, and why aren't we there yet? In part, it's because I believe, I mean, obviously, systems are self-perpetuating, and it's very difficult to dismantle them. I'm not leaving that I'm not meaning to minimize that. But when we don't meet people where they're at, we lose them. And when we lose them, they boomerang back into the system and they hold on to it with greater strength. So I think what's one of the things that I would like to talk about is I don't care what words we use. I've never been like a sort of a vernacular person. Call it human rights, call it DEI, call it inclusion, whatever you want to call it. What we really want is for everybody to have equal opportunity, truly equal opportunity to be truly included. And the only way we're going to get everybody there is to recognize that each individual is in their own space and place around this, and to meet them where they're at and help them move along. And I will leave I will leave that metaphor there for people to think about, and for there to be questions about if I think Karen has posted, and I don't know if people can see it, that questions to us can go to, because the Q&A doesn't seem to be working, info at ESJE, I'm sorry, esjeducation.ca. So somebody is there looking at the emails, info at esjeducation.ca, esjeducation.ca. So you can send questions in. I think the final thing I'd like to address has to do with communication and listening. One of the things we're currently working on at Enhancing Social Justice Education, ESJE, and that many other organizations are finally beginning to put in place, are workshops on how to depolarize conversations, how to have difficult conversations without becoming polarized, and what Hamlin said, walking away feeling whole at the end, not agreeing, but not feeling like you've been diminished as a result of that conversation. And this is a key to moving beyond DEI, to dismantling systems, because until everybody feels whole, at least in my opinion, until everybody feels whole and heard, again, they're going to cocoon back into themselves. They're going to not be ready to move forward. They're not going to be ready to give up what they may feel is their only place of control, or what we may see as power. And so I think one of the things that we have to consider is, again, my whole thing seems to be around the affective domain, but it's how we ask people to recognize where they're at, how we ask people to recognize what's going on, and how we hear where they're at, and how we hear how they're feeling. And I will close by saying that in the labor movement right now, particularly in the public sector labor movement, Hamlin talked about October 7th, and there is a lot of focus on Palestinian rights and what's happened in Gaza, and rightly so. There is an extraordinary humanitarian issue that has been going on for 80 years that needs to be addressed. Absolutely. But what has happened is folks who approach me who are mainstream Jewish union members, mainstream voices, feel excluded from the conversation because they don't feel heard. And I raise this as an example because until everybody can feel heard and feel whole in DEI circles, in human rights circles, in inclusion circles, whatever we want to call it, until everybody feels heard and whole at the end of being heard, and whole at the end of a conversation, we are going to continue to struggle as a movement. And Karen, I'm going to stop there, I think, and ask you to move on to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Leslie. I couldn't help as a psychologist think that what you were suggesting in terms of the learning and so on is based on sound cognitive developmental learning theory. You start where people are. We're going to have to make it safe as well to have conversations, because some people are being heard and they are being challenged and argued with and marginalized and silenced because the people in power in some of the positions in unions, in DEI spaces, and so on, have taken a politicized kind of agenda and are arguing with, if someone feels oppressed, hurt, harassed, it doesn't matter what their class, race, religion, ethnicity is. If they are being harassed, if there is hatred, fighting hatred with hatred doesn't cut it. And what is I'm setting the stage to turn it over to Kulbir, because what is the responsibility of a union person who's supposed to be representing all their members? And isn't one of the basic, or what is the responsibility of a principal or a professor or a teacher at the front of the room who is arguing with what is or isn't racism if a person of color has been harassed? What is and isn't anti-Semitism if a Jewish person has been, thrown coins at or screamed at or called names in the schoolyard? And what is the responsibility? And how do parents who may be hurling hatred at each other rather than having an administrator, a consultant, a DEI person, bringing in a third-party consultant and mediator who's skilled at these things, help them have those conversations at the same time as implementing anti-oppressive principles, equity, inclusion, anti-racism, human rights, justice, social justice, call it what you will, implementing those principles for every one of the employees, students, faculty, or members in their charge. That's our challenge in taking all of those alphabets, DEI, EDI. An article I wrote many years ago, was From Multiculturalism to Anti-Racism to Equity, and the subtitle was Sharing Power or Grabbing Power. And all of us on the screen here today want there to be a truly inclusive and human rights and justice approach to everything that we do. So, Kulbir, I turn it over to you as our administrator and advisor on taking EDI to the next level.
Thank you, Karen. And I think that lends beautifully to what I'm going to say. So I join you today from the traditional land of the Anishinaabe, and that includes the Ottawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations, covered by the Williams Treaties and Treaty 16 of 1815. So in a world where I feel some members of privileged or dominant groups do not want to talk about their identity, I show up to all spaces proudly, ready to share parts of my identity. I'm grateful to be here among the esteemed panel and panelists, talking about something that is very near and dear to me in terms of my personal and professional journey. My name is Kulbir Singh Dhaliwal, but I'm also known as Johnny to my family and close friends, and actually very proud that my niece is actually online today joining us, so that makes me very proud. I am professionally an elementary school principal, board director with Ontario Principals Council, and also a board director with New Path Youth and Family Mental Health Services. And this is my first time as a panelist, so I was quite nervous about how this was going to go for me today. Personally, I'm a single father, proud papa of my 9-year-old daughter and my 7-year-old son, who may or may not make some noise in the background, so I apologize. I identify as a Sikh, and when I think about my childhood, it was marked with experiences as a first-generation Canadian, low to middle class socioeconomic status, exposure to alcoholism, and domestic violence. So on paper, in school, I was a model student for the most part. I'm unsure if the system ever recognized or had any awareness of how I was showing up to school each day. I've had numerous professional experiences, those where I was celebrated and made to feel like I belonged and was encouraged to move further in my professional journey. But I've also had experiences where I've been held back, excluded, oppressed, or made to feel that systemic discrimination is alive and well. And I'm sure that's a common sentiment with many of you that are joining us today. I'm not the keeper of all knowledge, DEI. I'm not here to be an expert by any means, but I am one of billions of people on this planet that are trying to find their footing in a very complicated world. I want to emphasize that my contributions today do come from my own personal and professional experiences and don't necessarily represent the organizations for which I work and volunteer. So my experiences in life have led me to become very hyper-focused on equity, diversity, inclusion, social justice, anti-oppression, all of these terms that we've heard many, many times. mainly because I was tired of members of dominant groups dictating how marginalized folks like me in some parts of my identity ought to live. And even as I planned for this role on the panel today, I kept thinking, like, what can I bring? And even reflecting just on experiences that I had today, it kept on evolving the way I wanted to approach my role as a panelist. I think as a racialized leader, many of us have faced barrier after barrier. And it wasn't until I became involved with OPC that some of the barriers started to make more sense to me in terms of how I could approach and dismantle some of the oppression that I was facing. And in fact, I had a horrific professional experience in 2022. Quite frankly, it was a racist experience professionally. And that's what led me to OPC. That was the initial sort of point of connection. And I truly believe that everything happens for a reason. So even going through such a horrible experience in 2022, it actually allowed me to see things from a different perspective and position myself to ensure that myself or others don't go through experiences like that again. So I think things sometimes happened justly, and at other times they do position us to become stronger. When Chris references unpacking BS in bias, that really resonated with me. I loved it. And I tend to be a discerner myself. I tend to be a naysayer, questioner, advocate, and other things that tend to bring negative attention in educational spaces. I don't think they should, but they do. And some argue that they're career limiting roles for people to be taking as naysayers or disturbers. But to the people who we serve, especially as educators, we are their heroes. And we may not know it, we may never hear the story. But when we stand up and do what's right, we do become their heroes. And so that left me thinking about, well, if we're removing the BS, what does that leave? That leaves the IA in bias. And I thought of many different things. I thought about intentional action. I thought about intuitive allyship, improved affirmation of identities. And Chris, you mentioned that our brains are able to unlearn, relearn, and reflect. And I believe that this means that we also must interrupt actively and strive for internal accountability within the systems that we are working in. And I think of many, many different equity champions, social influencers like Jean Augustine, Harry Jerome, Lily Singh, Adrienne Clarkson, so many of them who have said things like advocacy is about self-preservation when there are no other options. It really becomes the only thing that we can do to survive the environments that we're in. I think about change coming as we cut one piece at a time, discomfort as the currency for necessary change, and the ongoing pursuit of justice. There was one quote that particularly stood out to me, which was, "Our work is not complete until all Canadians can say, 'I am Canadian,' without any hesitation or reservation." Especially as we consider the anti-immigrant rhetoric and the rise of fragility from dominant groups that we currently see in our socio-political situation. I'm sure that there are many people who have joined us today who were impacted the same way I was, seeing pickup trucks with Canadian flags and F. Trudeau stickers for many years. The messaging was not just about the Prime Minister, in my opinion, and it became a strong statement of hate towards many different groups. And in our current socio-political climate, principals are faced with some of these same challenges, such as identity-based harm. If we start talking about intersectionality of identities, some marginalized folks are on a pathway with no one else like them within their organizations. So yes, Chequity is satisfied when we hire people that look a certain way or fill a certain pocket of society. But I think this has come up by all of our panelists today. The leaders in these organizations also require support. There needs to be safety. We need to allow for professional growth, so that people who are normally or typically marginalized in society can overcome some of these challenges. And Chris, you talked about giving voice, and I really think that is the key. We have to listen to those who have been oppressed, and they have lots of contributions. So how do we do this work? How do we enhance social justice and anti-oppression? Chris left us with something to think about, talking about recognize, analyze, and mobilize. And so I categorized some of the things that I was reflecting on over the last several days in those three categories. And I think when it comes to recognition, we need to have a sense of who we share the space with and what experiences they have with systemness. And the basis of this can be a variety of collecting data, observing, having conversations with people. It could be anonymous surveys or not. And I don't think there's anyone who doesn't recognize oppression, but it's really asking the question about what do we do with it? We know it exists. What are we doing about it? And for some people, ignoring it is what's going to fulfill their pathway. And we need to disrupt that. We need to make sure that environments are safe for everyone to participate and progress. We've heard statements such as two things can be true, and that is true. But I think, Karen, when I mentioned that that was the perfect introduction to what I was going to say, we have to think about the value and the impact of statements and actions of people as we approach situations. And then when we come to analyze, I think it requires us to ask questions and engage in conversations to seek an understanding of the conditions that allow others to feel safe, included, but also to belong. And OPC has created that space for me, like I said, but they've also created that space for many other people. A prompt that I shared this week was to consider that, exceptional leaders are sometimes driven out of systems because they're not wanted, or they're made to feel like people don't want them there. And we heard several people today talk about, leaving systems or leaving organizations or leaving careers. And I tend to be somebody that refuses to leave. And I think that there's some strong value in that because it forces the organization to think about why we're not leaving. It forces others to think about the value that we bring to these organizations, but it also allows for people to have a pathway for them not to have to go through the same types of experiences. So you might have an adverse experience somewhere and maybe you need to leave, and that is a decision that one would make. But I also believe that there's strong value in staying in an organization and asking critical questions and pushing them to think about why their processes and system looks the way it does. And when we think about addressing resistance, I believe it starts and ends with relationships. And we heard some of those comments come up today from the other panelists. But it also involves having informed discussions. So knowing the resources that are out there to support us, advisories, PPMs, OHRC, policies, administrative procedures are all important in terms of having a third point for those difficult conversations, those courageous conversations. I also believe that while softening the question that Hamlin raised about asking which part of DEI, doesn't fit, I think that we move away from the essence of the issue. And I really think it is important to ask that question. And we must be direct and courageous in a respectful manner. So not everyone wants to climb the hill with us. As we heard the analogy there, at times there are people who refuse to climb that hill with us. And no matter how supportive we are or how much we try to understand why they don't want to be on that hill with us, whether we tap them on the back gently or not, they may never want to climb that hill with us, at least in our journey. And maybe they will with somebody else like us at some other point. But I do think that, continuing to have those respectful conversations, if people are willing to, can make a difference. I believe when we think about DEI and anti-oppression, that whether we're including or excluding people, it is important to understand the oppression from which one is seeking freedom. So when I hear people are resisting things like DEI or the concept of anti-oppression, it's important to ask the why. Why do you feel that way? What is it that is problematic? But we have to think, as Karen suggested, about who is impacted most. And that is where I think the focus needs to be. It needs to be focused on the people who have traditionally, historically, and continue to be oppressed within the systems. And so that takes me to the last point, mobilization. What does that look like? How do we continue to engage and work towards the progress that we want to see in our organizations and our systems? And how do we create the structures to support all people? And I think it basically comes down to understanding the purpose of why our organizations exist. So public education, we know why it exists, and we know that it is intended to serve all pupils. And so we need to hear their voices. We need to hear the voices of the community members, and we need to provide purposeful and authentic mentorship opportunities and relationships for those people who join our organizations as marginalized folks, and those students and community members who join us and are facing any type of resistance. I've also co-facilitated local and provincial affinity spaces, and I think that those affinity spaces have allowed people to come and share their experiences, to network with others who are having both successful and adverse experiences and finding ways to navigate through those challenges. Because I think the essence of the work that we do as DEI champions is to provide hope. We have to find the messaging of hope. How do we get through these challenges? Yes, they exist. And perhaps they're going to exist for a long time, but what are the steps that we can take to dismantle some of that? And as a school principal, I typically invite the silenced voices to be part of the table. I ask staff to think about who's getting awards at graduations or at awards assemblies, and how critically are we thinking about how representative of global identities and our school communities those names are. And I think another example is when we think about OPC's recent restructuring of their governance model, they intentionally created positions such as the EDI director, which I'm happily sitting in right now. And they've also created 2 directors selected from the Indigenous Leadership Circle. These are important little steps that have huge impact for many, many people. And I think that as school boards, as principals, as teachers, whatever role we fulfill in schools, we have to be constantly thinking about those things. How do we restructure the way we do things so that every voice is represented in what we're doing? I have lots that I can talk about. I see that we're at 5:29, so I'm just going to end with talking about that I think it's really important that we must support progress and freedom from, the said oppression that I've talked about. And again, I'm going to circle back to one of the quotes that I read earlier, which was, our work is not complete until all Canadians can say, I am Canadian, and all humans can safely feel like humans. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kulbir. Well, I one of our promises was fulfilled today, and that is that we ran out of time. We did start a few minutes late, and there was no way I was going to cut off any of the panelists. The part that we didn't get to was to have the panelists talk amongst themselves. I don't want to cut off the people who can stay for a little while longer. I mean, this is where, if we were in person, I would say, how many can stay a little while longer so we can have the conversation? But what I want to do, just so that it's fair, is go back to the final remarks that we left off here, right? And I just want to go back to wrap up first so that we then can open up the floor and turn everything off and turn off the recording. But please send in your questions, because again, this was an opportunity for you. Because I do want to share some of the resources that we promised that we would share with you, and to kind of wrap up and leave you with a little bit of hope. These are, again, volunteer organizations, the Enhancing Social Justice Education group that can and will do more in-depth sessions for you, and of course the Equity Summit group, which is a network for people to do this work as well. So some of the resources to remember are the Ontario Human Rights Commission, which Kulbir did mention, and it's all of those prohibited grounds that we have to remember, and not to confuse them. There's a tendency for people to want to call everything racism when it isn't racism. It may be national origin, it may be, and there's new words needed when there's discrimination on all 3 fronts. If it's racialized group, and it's religion, and it's ethnicity, and it's all wrapped up in one, and national origin, that's when we coin new terms, like anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, but we don't co-opt each other's terms. So we have to have those difficult conversations and fulfill the mandate of human rights, equity, diversity, inclusion, dignity, and everything else for everyone. Some of the other resources that exist, when we were having our meeting, Leslie pointed out, we shouldn't go too much into, the mechanisms of anti-racism and anti-oppression, because there's so many resources, and there are more that are being done. EDFO has a piece called the Anti-Oppressive Framework. There's a group called at Guelph who has also anti-oppression and anti-racism principles all outlined for each other. The for Innovation in Campus Mental Health has anti-oppressive, and the list goes on. These are the core principles. Again, you're getting this whole slide deck, but there's a whole paragraph that goes to each of these and how you actually I added my own at the bottom because the key thing is putting the principles into practice for everyone, not just for some, because some people are now called equity deserving and others aren't. You see, or some people should be included and others aren't, or because of the political international scene, it's okay for some people to be harassed. And so we need to access these other resources. I'm leaving you here before we stop the actual recording with my thanks to those who are our promotional partners. I don't know if your screen is doing this, but I have got the OPC's logo. But right now, the pictures at the side, I see Leslie's face is covering the OPC logo, but it's there in the slides, and you'll have all these slides. And please tell us what other issues, or give us some results or some comments at info@esjeducation there.ca so that we can address those questions. And if you have questions specifically or want to get in touch with each of our panelists or speaker for them to come and do a more in-depth session for you in their area of expertise, then I will send those questions on to them, and I will send your query onto them as well. So I am going to stop sharing now and go back to everybody, and I will definitely invite you to stay first for conversation that you'd like to share with everybody, or even just to throw out some respectful questions or comments. Yes, you can give your reactions with hearts and applause and whatever else, but let's open it up for those who can stay for a few more minutes. I know your panelists can, and open it up without the recording on now for the conversation.